Mafia boss wife invited black housekeeper to party as a joke, but she arrived in a luxury $2 million dress. The air in the Grand Hyatt ballroom shattered with the sound of a $500 crystal flute hitting the marble, a violent punctuation to a silence that had suddenly become absolute. Valentina Rossi, draped in sapphire silk and poisoned by her own arrogance, felt her champagne glass freeze halfway to her lips as the oxygen left the room. She had spent weeks orchestrating a public execution of dignity, inviting her little housekeeper to the city's most exclusive gala as a cruel masquerade. She had specifically commanded the girl to wear whatever a servant could afford, salivating at the thought of introducing a woman in polyester rags to the elite. But as Valentina turned toward the grand staircase, the joke didn't just fall flat, it disintegrated. Standing at the summit was a vision of celestial power that made every diamond in the room look like jagged glass. The woman who had scrubbed Valentina's floors for 6 months was gone. In her place stood a sovereign in deep, radiant ebony, draped in the legendary midnight sapphire gown. Woven from the night sky itself and encrusted with millions of light-drinking diamonds, the $2 million heritage piece refracted a galaxy across the gold-leafed walls. As she began her descent, each step slow, rhythmic, and regal, the elite crowd recoiled in instinctive, involuntary respect. Valentina's hand began to shake as she realized the terrifying truth. She hadn't been patronizing a maid, she had been pulling the tail of a sleeping dragon. The road to this social massacre had begun 3 days earlier in the suffocating vanity of the Rossi penthouse. Amanda had been on her knees in the walk-in closet, meticulously steam-cleaning designer loafers while Valentina and her hollow circle of friends looked on with predatory glee. To them, Amanda was merely a fixture, a tool that occasionally spoke. Valentina had tossed a pair of scuffed, retired heels at Amanda's feet, the sharp click of the plastic against the floor a metronome for her cruelty. "Come as yourself," Valentina had trilled, her voice a jagged edge disguised as silk. "I want my friends to see the help that keeps my world spinning. It will be a charming little joke between us." Amanda had played the part of the cornered mouse to perfection, lowering her gaze to hide the cold, electric clarity burning in her dark eyes. For 6 months, she had lived this lie as an experiment to see if the powerful were inherently cruel to those they deemed lesser. Valentina had provided a definitive, ugly answer. The moment the clicking of Valentina's heels faded, the maid stood up with the grace of a woman educated in Swiss boarding schools and reached for an encrypted satellite phone hidden beneath her cleaning supplies. "Julian," she had said into the receiver, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute command that would have turned Valentina's blood to ice. "The experiment is over. I need the vault opened and the midnight sapphire out by dawn. Valentina wants a show, let's give her a masterpiece." Now, as Amanda reached the final step of the grand staircase, the midnight sapphire caught the glare of the chandeliers, casting sharp, blue light onto Valentina's ashen face. The era of the invisible servant had ended, and as Amanda locked eyes with her former mistress, the room's gravitational pull shifted entirely toward the woman who truly owned the floor everyone was standing on. Valentina's husband, the mafia boss whose word was law, felt the glass in his hand nearly slip as he recognized the gown, a marker of an empire that dwarfed his own. He realized too late that the wolf was already inside the fold, and she was no longer hungry for a paycheck. She was here to collect a debt. The torrential rain battered the window of the small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of the city, a stark contrast to the sterile, marble perfection of the Rossi penthouse. Amanda sat in a corner booth, her damp uniform jacket draped over the seat beside her. She looked at her reflection in the dark surface of her coffee, a woman tired of playing a part that required her to be small. The heavy, scuffed shoes Valentina had thrown at her earlier that day sat in a trash bin outside. She would never touch them again. The bell above the door chimed, and a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped inside. Julian Cross looked exactly as he had 6 months ago. Sharp, observant, and entirely out of place in a dive like this. He scanned the room, his eyes softening only when they landed on Amanda. He slid into the booth across from her, placing a leather briefcase on the table with a muffled thud. You look exhausted, Amanda, Julian said, his voice a low baritone that carried the weight of decades of loyalty. I'm done, Julian, she replied, her voice losing its practiced subservience and regaining the crisp, authoritative edge of a woman born to lead. The Rossis aren't just elitists, they are predators. Valentina thinks she's inviting a maid to a gala to be mocked. She wants to see me in polyester so she can feel more like a queen. I've seen enough of their world from the floor. It's time to show them mine. Julian nodded slowly, opening the briefcase to reveal a thick stack of legal documents and an encrypted tablet. Your father would say you lasted longer than he expected. 6 months as a domestic worker without a single person suspecting you are the sole heiress to the Carter Diamond Empire is a feat in itself. But the board is getting restless. They need the queen to return to her throne. Amanda traced the edge of the table with a long, elegant finger. To the world, Amanda Nyla Carter was a ghost, the reclusive daughter of the late billionaire Silas Carter, a girl who had allegedly vanished into a life of quiet academic study abroad. In reality, she had been conducting a social experiment, testing if she could be seen for her character rather than her bank account. Valentina Rossi had failed that test in the most spectacular fashion possible. The Moretti Gala is their crown jewel, Julian continued, sliding the tablet toward her. It showed a blueprint of the Grand Hyatt security and a guest list that read like a directory of the global elite. If you walk through those doors as yourself, there is no going back. The anonymity you've enjoyed is over. The press, the rivals, the scavengers, they will all know you're back. Good, Amanda said, her eyes flashing with a cold, golden fire. Let them see. Valentina wants to use me as a prop for her cruelty. Instead, I'm going to use her gala as my stage. I don't just want to attend, Julian. I want to be the reason every woman in that room realizes their jewelry is second-rate. Julian reached into the briefcase one last time, pulling out a heavy, velvet-lined box. He clicked the latch open. Resting inside was a necklace of such intense, deep blue brilliance that it seemed to pull the light from the room. The Midnight Sapphire. It was a legendary stone, a Carter family heritage piece that hadn't seen the light of day in 20 years. I had it moved from the Paris vault an hour after you called, Julian whispered. It's ready. The question is, are you ready to stop being the girl who scrubs floors and become the woman who owns them? Amanda looked at the sapphire, then back at the man who had been her secret guardian since she was a child. She didn't hesitate. I was never the girl on the floor, Julian. I was just a queen in waiting. Tell the Rossi's driver I'll be making my own way to the gala. I think it's time I dressed for the life I actually afford. The rain continued to lash against the windows of Julian's private office, a sound like 1,000 whispers trying to break through the reinforced glass. Amanda stood before the massive, floor-to-ceiling vault, her reflection in the polished steel a sharp departure from the woman who had spent her morning scrubbing baseboards. The hum of the security system was the only sound in the room as Julian entered the final encryption key. With a soft, hydraulic hiss, the heavy door swung open, revealing the inner sanctum of the Carter heritage. Rows of velvet-lined cases stood like silent sentinels, each holding a piece of history that Valentina Rossi could only dream of possessing. Amanda walked past the gold and the emeralds, her eyes fixed on the center pedestal where a single, unassuming box rested. She reached out, her fingers steady as she lifted the lid. The midnight sapphire didn't just glitter. It seemed to hold a dark, celestial fire that pulled the ambient light into its depths. It was a piece designed not to merely decorate, but to dominate. You haven't worn that since the night your father passed, Julian remarked quietly, standing at the edge of the vault's threshold. It was meant for a queen who is ready to take what is hers. Are you sure about this, Amanda? Once you put that on, the world will never let you be ordinary again. Amanda lifted the heavy platinum chain, feeling the cold weight of the sapphire against her palm. The sensation was electric, a sudden grounding of her identity that had been fragmented by months of playing the submissive servant. She thought of the scuffed shoes Valentina had thrown at her, the way the Rossi inner circle had laughed as if she were a broken toy, and the quiet dignity she had forced herself to maintain while they treated her like a ghost. "I'm tired of being invisible, Julian," Amanda said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, icy certainty. "For 6 months, I've watched them from the shadows, listening to the way they talk about people who have nothing. They think their wealth gives them the right to erase the humanity of everyone around them. They think they can invite me to their gala as a punchline, a bit of charity, to make themselves feel righteous while they mock me." She stepped toward the mirror, holding the sapphire to her throat. The deep blue of the stone contrasted perfectly with her radiant ebony skin, creating an image of power that was both ancient and modern. "Valentina wants to show the world a maid in polyester. Instead, I'm going to show her a mirror of her own insignificance. I want her to feel the air leave the room when I walk in. I want her to realize that while she was playing at being a socialite, she was being judged by a woman who owns the very ground she stands on." Julian watched her, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He saw the transformation happening in real time, the slump of the servant's shoulders vanishing, replaced by the rigid, effortless posture of the Carter bloodline. "The jet is fueled and the security detail is on standby. We have 48 hours until the gala. What are your orders, Miss Carter?" "Prepare the midnight sapphire gown," Amanda commanded, her eyes meeting Julian's in the reflection with a look of predatory calm. "And find out who Valentina's biggest social rival is. If we're going to stage a coup, I want to make sure she has an audience that will appreciate every second of her downfall." The penthouse of Julian's private estate was a sanctuary of hushed efficiency, a world away from the abrasive demands of the Rossi household. The air here was scented with jasmine and expensive oils, a stark contrast to the sharp tang of bleach that had defined Amanda's existence for the last half-year. As the 5-hour transformation began, Amanda sat motionless, a marble statue surrendered to the hands of the best artisans Julian's influence could summon. The process was rhythmic and almost meditative. First came the skin. Hours of exfoliation and masks that stripped away the dullness of manual labor, revealing the flawless, glass-like radiance of her deep ebony complexion. Her skin absorbed the light of the room, beginning to glow with a natural luminosity that made the heavy stage makeup of socialites like Valentina seem like a desperate mask. As the stylist worked on her hair, weaving it into a regal, textured high updo that exposed the elegant line of her neck, Amanda looked down at her hands. For months, these hands had been raw from scrubbing marble and polishing silver. Now, they were being treated with a neutral-tone manicure, her long fingers being restored to their natural elegance. She watched as a diamond tennis bracelet was fastened around her wrist, the brilliant white stones resting against the very skin that had once been stained by the grime of Valentina's walk-in closet. The contrast was staggering. The maid was being systematically erased, replaced by the heiress in a metamorphosis that felt more like a reclamation than a costume change. When it was time for the gown, the room fell into a reverent silence. The midnight sapphire dress was brought in, a masterpiece of structured corset bodices and shimmering gemstones embedded throughout the fabric. As the silk slid over her skin, the weight of the royal train trailing behind her felt like the return of a forgotten crown. "The diamonds, Miss Carter," Julian whispered, stepping forward with the final pieces. Amanda reached for the drop earrings, feeling the weight of the diamonds as they caught the light, sparkling with a ferocity that matched the fire in her eyes. She adjusted the thin platinum necklace, the midnight sapphire resting perfectly above her collarbone. She was no longer the woman who stood in the shadows, she was the woman the shadows were afraid of. The final touch was the diamond clutch, held in hands that no longer felt the phantom sting of cleaning agents. Amanda stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her posture flawless, back straight, shoulders relaxed, head held high. The woman in the reflection didn't look like someone who had ever known humiliation. She looked untouchable, a mix of composure and controlled defiance that would soon silence the Grand Hyatt. "Valentina expects a joke," Amanda said, her voice steady and echoing with a newfound power. "But tonight, the punchline is going to cost her everything." She turned away from the mirror, her every movement slow and measured, her walk already carrying the weight of the power she had reclaimed. The transformation was complete. The maid was gone, and the Carter Diamond heiress was ready to descend. The grand double doors of the Moretti ballroom didn't just open. They seemed to surrender to the sheer force of the presence behind them. Amanda stood at the precipice of the marble staircase, a vision of starlit sapphire that defied the laws of the very world she had spent months scrubbing. Below her, the hum of elite gossip died a sudden, violent death, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the room. As she began her descent, every step was a deliberate, slow-motion strike against the ego of the woman waiting at the bottom. Amanda's radiant ebony skin glowed with a glass-like luminosity under the weight of the massive crystal chandeliers, reflecting the midnight sapphire gown that shimmered like a galaxy in motion. The guests didn't just look, they stared with mouths agape, champagne glasses trembling in hands that were suddenly, painfully aware of their own commonality. Valentina Rossi stood frozen in the center of the floor, her ruby silk gown, the dress she thought would be the crown of the evening, now looking like a cheap, garish mistake. Her porcelain skin had turned a sickly, ghostly gray as she watched her joke walk toward her with the effortless power of a sovereign. The whispers started as a low vibration, a frantic rustle of satin and silk as the elite realized who was beneath the diamonds. "Is that the housekeeper?" A woman hissed behind a feathered fan, her eyes wide with a mix of horror and forbidden delight. Standing just a few feet from Valentina was her fiercest social rival, Isabella Conti, a woman whose tongue was known to be more dangerous than a mafia contract. Isabella let out a sharp, melodic laugh that sliced through the stunned silence like a diamond through glass. She stepped closer to Valentina, her eyes never leaving Amanda's approaching figure. "Oh, Valentina, darling," Isabella whispered, her voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding circle of titans and heirs. "You really have outdone yourself this time. I knew you were desperate for attention, but I never imagined you'd go so far as to be completely outclassed by your own help." Valentina's hand tightened around her champagne flute until the glass began to groan. She shouldn't be here," she hissed through gritted teeth, though her voice lacked any of its usual venom. "Shouldn't be here." Isabella arched a perfectly groomed brow, leaning in with a predatory grin. "She's the only person in this room who actually looks like she belongs in those jewels. Look at her, Valentina. She isn't wearing that dress, she's commanding it. Tell me, did you pay her extra to make you look this pathetic, or was it a gift?" The mockery rippled outward. The socialite rival's words acted as a permission slip for the rest of the room to pivot. Guests who had spent the morning ignoring Amanda's presence in the Rossi hallways were now leaning away from Valentina as if her social failure were contagious. The power shift was physical, it was an invisible tide receding from the Rossis and rushing toward the woman in sapphire. Amanda reached the final step, her chin lifted just high enough to acknowledge the room without needing their approval. She was no longer a ghost in the hallways. She was the epicenter of the storm, and as she met Valentina's wide, panicked eyes, the hidden queen finally let a subtle, untouchable smile touch her lips. The joke was over, and the elite had already chosen their new sovereign. The heavy silence of the Grand Hyatt ballroom was no longer empty, it was charged with the electric friction of 100 unanswered questions. Amanda remained perfectly composed at the base of the staircase, the midnight sapphire radiating a deep, celestial glow that seemed to anchor the entire room to her presence. Valentina Rossi's face remained a mask of ashen disbelief, her ruby silk gown now a garish footnote to the quiet authority radiating from the woman she had once ordered to scrub her baseboards. The elite crowd held its collective breath, caught between the instinct to mock a servant and the undeniable evidence of the royalty standing before them. Breaking that tension was a sound that everyone in the room knew, the measured, rhythmic footsteps of Sebastian Rowe. As the Moretti estate's head butler and the unofficial arbiter of high society protocol, Sebastian was a man who had seen 5 decades of dynasties rise and fall. He moved through the crowd with a grim, professional grace, his eyes fixed not on the gown, but on the intricate platinum filigree supporting the central stone of Amanda's necklace. As he came to a halt 3 paces from Amanda, the room watched with bated breath. Valentina took a half-step forward, her voice a desperate, high-pitched quiver. "Sebastian, thank goodness. Please, escort this intruder out. She's stolen those jewels, and she's making a mockery of." Sebastian didn't even turn his head. His focus remained locked on the crest engraved into the sapphire setting, a hidden mark of the Carter diamond empire that only those trained in the deepest histories of the industry would recognize. His eyes, usually clouded with the professional indifference of his station, suddenly sharpened with a shock of pure, unadulterated recognition. The air in the ballroom seemed to thicken as Sebastian Rowe, a man who had not bowed to anyone below the rank of a head of state in 20 years, slowly bent his head. He didn't just nod, he executed a deep, formal bow of absolute fealty, his hand over his heart in the traditional salute of the Carter family's most trusted staff. "The Carter heritage has been missed in these halls, Your Excellency," Sebastian's voice boomed, clear and steady, carrying into every corner of the silent ballroom. "I had wondered when the true moon would rise to eclipse the paper stars." The sound of his voice broke the room's paralysis like a hammer through ice. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, more violent than any whisper. The socialite rival, Isabella Conti, leaned back, her mocking smile widening as she watched Valentina's world literally crumble in real time. If Sebastian Rowe was bowing, then the woman in the sapphire wasn't an intruder, she was the owner. Amanda looked down at the veteran butler, her expression softening just enough to acknowledge the man who had served her father's allies for years. "It's good to see you again, Sebastian," she said, her voice rich and melodic, lacking any of the forced humility Valentina had tried to beat into her. "It seems some in this house have forgotten what true legacy looks like." "They shall be reminded tonight, Miss Carter," Sebastian replied, rising from his bow with a look of predatory satisfaction directed toward the Rossis. He stepped to her side, ready to clear a path that no one would dare block again. The recognition was total. The maid was dead, and the Carter Empress had finally reclaimed her throne, leaving Valentina Rossi standing in the wreckage of a joke that had turned into her social obituary. The atmosphere in the Grand Hyatt ballroom, once a lively hum of high society networking, had curdled into a thick, suffocating dread. Alessandro Moretti stood at the edge of the VIP lounge, his hands gripped so tightly around the balcony railing that his knuckles were bone white. He wasn't looking at the shimmering chandeliers or the sea of stunned guests, his predatory gaze was locked onto the woman standing beside Sebastian Rowe. For months, he had tolerated his wife's stories of a clumsy maid, with the half-interested indulgence of a man who viewed domestic staff as furniture. But as the veteran butler bowed to Amanda, Alessandro felt a cold, jagged shard of realization pierce through his arrogance. He turned toward Valentina, who was still gasping like a fish out of water, her face a pathetic mask of crumbling vanity. "Valentina," he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that carried the lethal promise of a thunderstorm. "Tell me exactly what you said to her." "Every word." "Alessandro, I didn't know," she stammered, her ruby silk gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume in the shadow of his growing rage. "She was just a girl from the agency. I thought it would be funny to show her how we live. I told her to wear whatever a servant could afford. I never thought." "You never thought?" Alessandro roared, though he kept his voice low enough to avoid a public scene, the intensity of his fury making those nearby recoil. "You invited Amanda Carter, the sole sovereign of the Carter Diamond Empire, to my house as a punchline. You forced the woman who controls 40% of the global diamond trade, the woman whose family provides the very stones that fund our operations, to hand-wash your clothes." He looked back at Amanda, who was now moving through the crowd with Sebastian. Every titan of industry and political heavyweight in the room was already pivoting toward her, sensing the shift in gravity. The Moretti name was built on the trade of luxury and blood. To offend the woman who stood at the summit of that luxury was more than a social blunder. It was a strategic catastrophe. "Do you have any idea what this means?" Alessandro hissed, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, calculated madness. She didn't stay in our house because she needed the work. She was watching us. She was judging us. And you gave her every reason to despise the Moretti name. You threw shoes at a woman who could buy and sell this entire city before breakfast. Valentina sank onto a velvet chair, her legs finally giving out. The joke she had carefully cultivated for weeks had just become a noose around their necks. Alessandro didn't offer her a hand. He smoothed his tuxedo jacket, his mind racing through a dozen damage control scenarios, all of which seemed futile against the cold, starlit brilliance of Amanda's sapphire. He realized then that the woman he had treated as invisible was now the only thing he could see. He had allowed a wolf into his fold, and his wife had spent the entire time pulling its tail. As he stepped forward to begin a desperate, probably doomed apology, he knew that by dawn, the Moretti influence would be as shattered as the crystal flute on the floor. Amanda Carter hadn't just come to the gala, she had come to collect a debt Alessandro wasn't sure he could pay. The silence that followed Alessandro's withdrawal was not peaceful, it was the pressurized quiet of a courtroom before a verdict. Amanda moved through the parting crowd with the fluid, predator-like grace of someone who had never truly belonged in the shadows. Every eye in the ballroom was a witness to the shifting of the world's axis. Standing in the center of the floor, Valentina Rossi looked smaller than she ever had, her ruby silk gown now a garish reminder of a reign that had ended the moment Sebastian Rowe bowed. Amanda stopped exactly 3 feet from her former employer. Up close, the midnight sapphire gown didn't just shimmer, it seemed to pulse with a dark, ancient power that made Valentina's sequins look like plastic toys. The air between them was cold, vibrating with the ghost of every insult Valentina had hurled over the past 6 months. "You're shaking, Valentina," Amanda said, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the frantic gasps of the socialites surrounding them. It wasn't the voice of a maid. It was the voice of a woman who owned the silence she spoke into. Valentina's hand flew to her throat, her fingers fumbling with a diamond pendant that suddenly felt like a trinket. You tricked us," she hissed, though the venom lacked its usual sting, replaced by a raw, naked terror. "You came into my home. You let me treat you like a human being." Amanda finished for her, a sharp, obsidian edge beneath her words. "No. You treated me like a mirror for your own insecurities. You needed me to be small so you could feel tall. You needed me to be invisible so you could convince yourself you were worth looking at." Amanda stepped closer, her height and the regal textured updo of her hair making her seem to loom over the other woman like a descending storm. She looked down at the scuffed, discarded designer heels Valentina had thrown at her in the closet, now a memory that seemed a lifetime away. "You told me to wear whatever a servant could afford for your little joke," Amanda continued, her gaze dropping to the midnight sapphire resting against her collarbone. The gem caught the light of the chandeliers, throwing shards of deep blue fire across Valentina's pale, horrified face. "I took your advice to heart. I wore exactly what I could afford. It just so happens that what I can afford is the very ground you are standing on, the ceiling above your head, and the legacy your husband is currently begging me not to dismantle." Valentina looked around the room, searching for an ally, but found only the cold, judgmental stares of her peers. Isabella Conti was watching with a glass of champagne held to her lips, her eyes dancing with the malicious joy of seeing a predator become the prey. There was no one coming to save her. "I didn't trick you, Valentina," Amanda whispered, leaning in so only the other woman could hear the finality in her tone. "I simply gave you a stage. You chose to play the villain. Tonight, the curtain falls, and tomorrow, the Rossi name will be nothing more than a footnote in a story about a maid who knew her worth better than her mistress ever did." She didn't wait for a response. Turning her back on the wreckage of Valentina's social life, Amanda signaled to Julian Cross, who was already waiting at the edge of the floor with her wrap. She had worn what she could afford, and the cost was a debt the Rossis would be paying for the rest of their lives. The sleek, obsidian doors of the Carter Diamond Empire's executive floor hissed open with a sound like a drawn breath. Amanda walked through the threshold, her heels clicking against the polished basalt with a sharp, rhythmic authority that signaled the end of her exile. The morning sun flooded the boardroom, turning the panoramic view of the city into a gold-flecked backdrop for the woman who had spent 6 months learning the value of the shadows. She was no longer encased in the midnight sapphire gown. Instead, she wore a structured power suit of deep charcoal, its lines as clean and lethal as a diamond's edge. Julian stood at the head of the table, his expression one of quiet triumph as he watched the board of directors rise in unison. The room, which had once felt like a cage of tradition and stagnant wealth, now vibrated with the energy of a queen who had seen the world from the ground up. Amanda didn't sit immediately. She walked to the window, looking down at the tiny, moving dots of the city's workers, the couriers, the cleaners, the silent machinery of the elite, and saw herself in every one of them. For 70 years, this company has measured success by the clarity of its stones and the thickness of its margins, Amanda began, her voice steady and resonant, carrying the weight of a woman who had reclaimed her name. But I have spent the last half year in a world where those stones mean nothing if the hands that polish them are treated as disposable. I've seen how easy it is for people with everything to convince themselves that the people who serve them have nothing. That ends today. She signaled to Julian, who activated the central display. A new structural outline appeared, titled the Carter Foundation, the Dignity Initiative. This wasn't a standard corporate charity designed for tax write-offs or hollow PR, it was a fundamental restructuring of how the empire interacted with its vast human network. The Carter Foundation will not just be a fund, Amanda stated, turning to face the directors with a gaze that brooked no dissent. It will be a watchdog. We are implementing a mandatory living wage and comprehensive legal protection for every contractor and domestic worker within our sphere of influence. If a firm wants to do business with us, they must prove that their staff is treated with the same respect we afford our executives. No one under the Carter umbrella will ever be invisible again. No one will be a punchline for a socialite's ego. One of the older directors leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Miss Carter, this is a radical shift in our philanthropic budget. The Rossis and their associates will see this as a direct challenge to their lifestyle. It isn't a challenge, Amanda corrected him, a ghost of a predatory smile touching her lips as she thought of Valentina's ashen face in the ballroom. It's an ultimatum. The Rossis and those like them built their pedestals on the backs of the silent. I am simply giving those people a voice. If our associates cannot handle being treated as equals by the people who make their lives possible, they are free to find their diamonds elsewhere. But they will find that the Carter name now carries a price that money cannot pay, integrity. She finally sat at the head of the table, her hands resting flat on the mahogany surface, the same hands that had once been raw from bleach, now steady and empowered. The era of the hidden queen was over. In its place, a new reign had begun, one defined not by the gems she wore, but by the protection she offered to those still standing in the shadows. Amanda Carter had returned, and she was making sure the world finally learned how to see. The sun set over the city, but for the first time in years, the view from the Carter penthouse didn't feel like a lonely fortress. Amanda stood on the balcony, the evening breeze catching the light silk of her robe. Below, the city was beginning to twinkle, a sprawling tapestry of millions of lives, none of whom she viewed as invisible anymore. The midnight sapphire sat in its velvet box on the vanity inside, its mission accomplished. It was no longer a weapon of social destruction, it was once again a symbol of a promise kept. The fallout from the Moretti Gala had been swift and absolute. The Rossi name had vanished from the guest lists of the elite, replaced by the grim headlines of their financial restructuring and public apologies. But Amanda didn't find her satisfaction in their ruin. She found it in the letters piled on her desk, notes from domestic workers, contractors, and silent staff who now felt the protection of the Foundation's Dignity Initiative. Julian stepped onto the balcony, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. He looked at Amanda, seeing not just the heiress he had protected, but the leader she had become. The first round of audits for our partners is complete, he said softly. 3 major firms have already overhauled their labor practices just to stay on our roster. You've changed the rules of the game, Amanda. The game was rigged, Julian, she replied, taking a glass and looking out at the horizon. I just reminded them that a diamond is only beautiful because of the light that passes through it. Without the people who polish them, protect them, and carry them, they're just cold stones. She turned back toward the interior of the penthouse, where a new portrait of her father had been hung. In the painting, he wasn't wearing jewels or sitting in a boardroom, he was smiling in a garden, his hands dirty with soil. Amanda realized now that her 6 months in the Rossi household hadn't been an exile. It had been her true education. She had learned that the highest ceiling and the lowest floor are made of the same material, and that true royalty is found in how one treats those who have no power to give anything in return. The board meeting is at 8 tomorrow, Julian reminded her as he turned to leave. I'll be there, Amanda said, her voice a calm, steady resonance. And Julian? Tell the kitchen staff they are invited to the morning briefing. I want to hear their thoughts on the new facility designs. As the door clicked shut, Amanda took one last look at the city. She was no longer the hidden queen, and she was no longer the maid. She was Amanda Nyla Carter, a woman who had seen the darkness and chosen to become the light. The experiment was over, but the reign, the one built on respect and integrity, was only just beginning. Thank you for listening, kindly subscribe to my channel and follow for more interesting romance stories.